SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 27. Resolutions. The Sunday following the start of the new year brought a steady trickle of students back to the castle throughout the day. While many took the Hogwarts Express, a fair amount traveled to Hogsmeade with family or friends, and then made their way back up to the school as the day went on. Most of the 8th years took advantage of the privilege of a direct flu appointment back to the headmistress's office, and the older witch was given the enjoyable opportunity to greet and chat with each of them upon their return. Shortly before lunch, a tall blonde appeared in the green flames as she glanced up from her desk. "Hello, Mr. Malfoy," McGonagall said. "Hello, Professor." He grinned at her as he brushed off soot from his robes. "Happy New Year." Slightly surprised by his exuberant greeting, she raised her eyebrows and took in the countenance of the young man before her. He seemed genuinely happy, and even more relaxed than he had been the last time he'd sat in her office. If she wasn't mistaken, it almost seemed as if he couldn't contain the smile etched across his face. "I trust you had a good holiday," she asked him as he came closer and stood behind the chair across from her, placing his hands on the top of the rounded back. "Yes, thank you. And you?" Draco responded politely. "Oh, yes. We had quite a few students remain for the duration, which is always pleasant." She pinned him with an inquisitive look. "Any plans to fill the rest of your days since you've returned quite early?" She was amused to see his cheeks turn slightly pink and his gaze falter away from hers as he shook his head. "No, not really. Just going to head off to the room to unpack and have lunch with whoever is back." He trailed off and couldn't quite bring himself to look her in the eye, instead focusing on the fabric of the chair he was currently gripping. Yes," the headmistress mused. "I believe several of your housemates have returned already." Draco's head whipped up in her direction at this announcement, and she decided to let the poor boy off easy. "Miss Granger has not yet returned, but I believe she is scheduled to come through in about an hour." She actually had to stifle a small laugh at the way his entire face seemed to light up. If she wasn't much mistaken, some sort of development in the relationship between the two students must have taken place over the holidays. Draco reined in his enthusiasm with no small degree of difficulty, and tried to school his features into a more traditional mask of indifference, but gave up when his cheeks refused to relax from the ridiculous grin he knew to be stretching across his face. Why hide it? "Thank you, Professor." He nodded courteously and made his way to the door, mentally debating if he'd have enough time to unpack before coming back up here to meet Hermione when she arrived. He was so engrossed in his own thoughts, he didn't hear the quiet and uncharacteristic chuckle coming from the other side of the desk as the door closed behind him. Roughly an hour later, Draco was heading back down the corridor towards the headmistress's office to find his favorite former Gryffindor, when he saw a figure striding towards him. Something about the broad shoulders and swaggering strut was familiar. "Malfoy, is that you?" A booming voice called to him, and he recognized the owner at once. "Pusey, what brings you here?" Draco stopped walking as his former Quidditch teammate came to stand in front of him, extending a hand in greeting, which Draco shook firmly. Adrian had been 2 years ahead of Draco, and a talented chaser on the Slytherin team. "I've been granted a seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors," Adrian responded proudly. "Just been up to see McGonagall to fill out the paperwork." "Really? A school governor?" Draco was more than a little surprised. Adrian wasn't exactly a troublemaker during his school days, but he also wasn't a serious student. He had a bit of an aggressive streak in him, especially when challenged by others. More than anything, Draco just thought he was really young to be given such a grand title. He remembered his father referring to the other governors as feeble-minded old men. "Well, several of the seats were vacated after their previous occupants were sentenced to Azkaban, weren't they?" Adrian smirked slightly as he watched Draco for a reaction. He remembered his younger housemate often using Lucius's prominent place as a bragging point, or even as a threat. The elder Malfoy wasn't the only member of the board to be caught up in the wrong side of the war, and the remaining members had to be quick to decide that younger, less prejudiced voices would be the wise choice to fill those empty seats. The Puseys, although in the upper echelon of pureblood society, had greatly distanced themselves from Voldemort's notions, and had spent the better part of the last 2 years abroad. Draco didn't feel like responding to the quip about his father, instead changing the topic entirely. "How was your Christmas?" Adrian seemed mildly disappointed that he failed to get under Draco's skin, but shrugged it off. Good. Spent most of it at our family's place in Switzerland. My mother and sister are still there, but Father and I returned home yesterday. Back to work tomorrow." "Are you working with your father?" Draco asked. "Yeah, since I finished here. Investment banking isn't the most exciting job in the world, but it's not all that bad. Plus, it allows me to travel since a lot of our clients live outside of Britain." Adrian wiggled his eyebrows conspiratorially. Ever seen the witches in Mykonos? Draco chuckled wryly, remembering his former housemate's relentless pursuit of every witch he deemed pretty enough to garner his attention, whether they wanted it or not. As Adrian launched into a description of one of his recent romantic conquests, Draco saw another figure coming down the corridor towards them. Even at a further distance than he'd spotted Adrian, he knew exactly who it was, and his heart both sped up and dropped to his feet at the same time. He really didn't want Hermione to be subjected to Pusey's typically boorish behavior, but he had no way of stopping her approach without drawing even more attention to her presence. Before he could begin concocting a plan to avoid an interaction, she was at his side, smiling at him with such genuine happiness that he felt each breath catch. His gaze flickered between her and Adrian, who had also noticed her arrival and had stopped mid-sentence to stare unapologetically at her. "Pusey, this is—" he began, but Adrian cut him off. "Hermione Granger." Adrian's dark eyes roved slowly from the curls escaping the bun on top of her head to the tips of her trainers that peeked out beneath her jeans, and back up again to rest on her face with a predatorial gleam. He reached out to take her hand and raised it to his smirking lips as he bowed slightly. "A pleasure to officially meet you. I'm Adrian Pusey." Hermione snatched her hand back with as much grace as she could manage and returned his gaze with a stiff smile. "Nice to meet you, Adrian." She turned to meet Draco's eyes, which were flashing with annoyance. His jaw clenched in obvious irritation. He softened a little when he looked at her, and she gestured beyond them. "I'm going to head to the room to unpack. Find me for lunch?" Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smirking. She liked that he seemed bothered by Adrian's attention. Not that he had anything to worry about, but it was sweet all the same. Draco nodded, and both he and Adrian watched her walk away. A low whistle came from the older of the two young men. "She's definitely grown into her looks, hasn't she?" His eyes were still fixed on the retreating figure now further down the hall. Draco glared at him, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Adrian finally quit staring and looked back at his former teammate, and noticed the less-than-friendly expression on his face. "What? You don't think she's hot?" Draco inhaled deeply through his nose and reminded himself that punching a school governor was not the best way to start off the new term. Before he could formulate a response, Adrian seemed to have reached his own conclusions. "You fancy her, don't you?" he crowed with great amusement. "You actually like the little swat." He guffawed loudly and gave Draco a seemingly friendly punch in the arm. "Good luck, mate. You think the Gryffindor princess would pick you, the school bully and a disgraced Death Eater?" He chuckled again and placed a hand on Draco's shoulder, causing the tall blonde to bristle. "Don't worry, I won't get in your way. But when she turns you down, let me know. I'm sure I could find a few ways to impress the Golden Girl." He sneered, and Draco shrugged the weighty hand off his shoulder, his entire being now pulsing with anger. Channeling every non-Slytherin trait he could think of, Draco coldly regarded his former teammate and spoke through clenched teeth. "Good luck on the Board of Education's, Pusey." And with that, he spun on his heel and stalked off towards the room, leaving Adrian still chortling in the empty corridor. Upon reaching the eighth-year dormitory, Draco took several deep, calming breaths before opening the door and entering the familiar common area. He hadn't felt that angry in months, and he also couldn't remember the last time he had been at such a loss for words. It wasn't that he didn't want to put Pusey in his place, he definitely did, but he knew that if he had made it clearly known that he was interested in Hermione, Pusey would have taken that as a challenge. For all Draco knew, he already had. Draco let out a small, frustrated growl and made his way to his room. He needed a few minutes to cool down and collect his thoughts. As he sat on the edge of his bed, he reminded himself of the things Harry had said to him on New Year's Eve, and the support he'd found from his housemates and other newly forged friendships. He was not the person Adrian described anymore. He knew it. And clearly Hermione knew it, or she wouldn't be interested in a relationship with him. Speaking of, now that they were back at school, he wondered what this would mean for them. Obviously they would still have classes and meals together, but should he offer to carry her books for her? Would she let him hold her hand in the corridors as they walked to class? Could he take her to Hogsmeade for a date? His mind was swimming with ideas and visions of the two of them walking down a snowy lane, or curled up in chairs in front of the fireplace, or strolling around the lake in the spring. Maybe he could see if Professor Sprout had any flowers he could put a bouquet for her. Merlin's saggy pants! He was becoming a hopeless romantic. He knew Hermione was very practical and definitely not that sort of prissy, high-maintenance girl who needed constant trinkets or compliments to make her feel secure. He was positive she would prefer a quiet cup of tea and a few hours browsing in a bookshop to a 5-course candlelit dinner, but he wanted to do those things for her. He wanted to take her to the biggest library in the world, to fill her room with roses, to go for moonlit strolls on a beach, to, "Hey." A soft voice jolted him out of his reverie, and he snapped his gaze up to find the witch he had just been daydreaming about leaning against his doorframe, with a mildly concerned look on her face. He jumped up and strode over to her. "Hey, I didn't hear you come in." He couldn't understand why he felt so nervous all of a sudden, and stuffed his hands into his pockets to keep them from shaking. "I knocked, but the door wasn't shut all the way, so it pushed open. You look seriously deep in thought. It actually took 3 tries to get your attention." Hermione raised an eyebrow in teasing inquisition. "What's got you so contemplative today?" He met her compassionate gaze and huffed out a sigh that seemed to help dislodge the figurative snitch that was fluttering inside his ribcage. Before he could stop himself, he answered honestly. "You." Her eyes widened a little. "Me?" Draco cleared his throat and shuffled his feet, looking off past her shoulder now. "Yeah, just, now that we're back here and all, just wondering." His voice trailed off as he failed to come up with a way to express his question in a manner that didn't make him sound like an amateurish dolt. "Wondering what people will think?" she supplied for him, watching him carefully as he continued to struggle to meet her eye. "No," he blurted out quickly. "Not what others will think, exactly. I guess I just wasn't sure what you wanted people to know about us, or whatever," he finished lamely. She studied him for a few seconds and then surprised him by grabbing his arm and gently steering him to the side of his bed, where they both sat down. She continued to stare at him as if trying to figure out a puzzle. She had a pretty good idea where this random bout of insecurity was coming from, and she wanted to alleviate his fears without making him feel bad for having them. "Draco, I am not the least bit concerned with what other people know or think or any of it." She saw him peek at her from the corner of his eye, which had been fixed stubbornly on the floor since they'd sat down. "If I was worried about anything like that, I wouldn't have danced with you at Harry's, seeing as almost all of our housemates were there." His cheek twitched with the beginnings of a smile, and she allowed herself a small smirk. "As for the rest of the school, I'm pretty sure all of the first years already think you're my boyfriend, so it won't really be big news, will it?" He turned to see her eyes glinting with mischief, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Your boyfriend?" he croaked out. "Well, if you want to be, that is." She nudged him playfully with her elbow. "Draco, I don't care about labels. I don't care what other people think we might or might not be. Like I said the day we left for the halls, this is all new to us, and I'm not in any rush to give it a title or a timeline or what have you." She turned to face him more fully, placing both of her hands on his arm and peering intently into the pewter eyes she'd grown so very fond of. "I'm just happy being with you and seeing where this goes, yeah?" He exhaled rather more dramatically than he'd intended, not realizing how shallow his breathing had been for the last several minutes. He covered her hands with his own and finally, solidly met her sincere gaze. "Yeah, that sounds brilliant." He plucked up his courage and leaned in to give her a quick, soft kiss, which he was pleased to see caused her cheeks to blush prettily. "And I think I do want people to know I'm your boyfriend. Just, to keep all the other blokes away." He smirked at her and she giggled. "Whatever makes you happy," she joked before giving him a kiss on the cheek and hopping off the bed. "Let's go eat lunch. I'm starving." Draco chuckled and shook his head as he allowed her to tug him from his chambers into the room to join their friends. It's amazing how, once you return from being somewhere else, in a matter of hours it's like you never left. Routine is a relied upon and often embraced familiarity, and that sentiment was no different from the students at Hogwarts than the rest of the world. Within the very first week back to school, after the Christmas holidays, the 8th year's days were filled with classes, homework, meals, NEWT preparation, and meetings with their first years. Hermione had decided to have their group time first, before meeting with them individually, and their hour around the dinner table was filled with stories of their weeks and their families, presents they received, and thoughts about the new term ahead of them. She asked if any of them had made any New Year's resolutions, simply to find out that Darla was the only one who knew what she was talking about. "What's a resoluting?" Malcolm asked. "Resolution," Hermione corrected. "It's a sort of goal you set for yourself, something you wish to do, or change, or try in the coming year. My mom made one of those last year to redecorate the drawing rooms, and to clean out the 2 big closets upstairs." Darla looked thoughtful as she speared a piece of chicken with her fork. "I don't think she ever finished the closets." "What about the redecorating?" Allison asked. "Well, she changed the wall color in the drawing room, and the drapes, but she and my dad got in a big row about the furniture. Apparently it's been in his family for generations, and he refused to get rid of it. There's even some sort of charm on all of the pieces to keep them from being altered in any way, so they're still the same horrid shade of mustard yellow, which doesn't really match the new green walls." She scrunched up her nose at the thought. We don't spend a whole lot of time in that room. Hermione chuckled and glanced over to see Malcolm frowning at his mashed potatoes, which he was swirling with his fork. Something wrong, Malcolm? The young Gryffindor met her eyes, brow still creased, but more in thought than in anger. No, I'm just trying to think of a good resolution to make. Resolution, Darla and Allison said together. Yeah, that. Malcolm sat up a little straighter. I want to do something new this year. That's terrific, Hermione smiled encouragingly. What do you want to try? I'm not sure yet, but I think I might have an idea, he smiled secretively. But I don't want to say just yet, in case I change my mind. The girls groaned in annoyance, but quickly took over the conversation with their own ideas for resolutions. Hermione watched them all fondly, particularly proud of the friendlier and more optimistic side of Malcolm that was making an appearance. She knew his participation in Draco's flying lessons had helped him forge several friendships, and was very glad to see that the time away from school hadn't dampened his more amicable tendencies. She was curious to know what he'd been thinking about for a goal, but was happy to wait until he was ready to share that on his own. Hermione, what resolution did you make for this year? Allison asked her, interrupting her musings. She thought for a moment, knowing she was definitely not about to share anything too personal with her young charges. She knew for a fact that anything she said would be passed around every first-year dorm in the castle before the end of the day tomorrow. I definitely want to do well on my NEWTs, she began, and her statement was met with rolled eyes and snorts, but of course, and how boring. She chuckled and held up a hand to stall the protest. I also would like to travel somewhere I've never been before, and I would really like to get a job in the department in control of magical creatures. As she expected, this launched a discussion on places they all wanted to travel, and an endless array of questions about what she wanted to do if she got the job. Unbeknownst to the animated trio at the table, their mentor's thoughts were rather stuck on one particular wizard she wanted to include in all her future plans.